So we are making our way through this book, Separation of Church and Hate. And I'm just taking a couple of chapters each week and kind of summarizing the material that's there. I'm supplementing with some thoughts of my own. But it is a very good book, and it's an easy read. It's very well outlined. And the couple of chapters that we're going to look at tonight in part four of this study is what I'm calling, this is not the title of a chapter, but what I'm calling cultural conflicts. And what I want to do tonight is talk about three of them. And the way I want to summarize them is primarily in light of how Christianity is often energized by the people um, that we criticize. I hesitate to use the word hate, although there's portions of Christianity that has that element to it. So when we look at the current landscape of Christianity, I think one of the things that we see is that there are three groups of people that are used as kind of like a political football, and it drives a lot of politics. And unfortunately, it has come to define Christianity as we know it in our current environment. And the three groups of people are they are scapegoated for some of the problems of society. And it begins with women. First of all, we talked a little bit about not hating women in our last study, but the main reason for a lot of the criticism is because of the subject of abortion. The second group is foreigners, scapegoating foreigners as part of our cultural landscape because the people that are coming in are criminals and we shouldn't allow immigration. And then the third group is scapegoating the lower class in society, the poor, those that are on the margins, that can't carry their weight in society, you might say. So the summary of tonight is these are cultural issues, yes, but there are also targets here in mind. So to kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we go through them tonight. So let's go back to last week for a moment. We talked a little bit about how sometimes women are looked down upon, and sometimes it took a while before women were granted equal status in society, the ability to vote, and other issues as well. And then what we find is that in the rise of feminism, there was a lot of pushback on that because they were not following the biblical cultural code of the Bible of being submissive to their husbands, and that's all from last week. The main topic that puts women kind of in the hot seat is this subject of abortion. Now, this has become a cultural hotspot really since I became a Christian. This particular subject really zoomed to the top since 1970. I came to Christ in 1975. And of course, I was not picking up on all of these cultural nuances because I was so young in the faith. But the subject of abortion is still one of the primary topics that is often used in campaigning. And so we'll see it when midterms come around this November. It will come up again. And when we talk about the subject of abortion, we can talk about it as a political, theological, and social issue. However, on a practical level, abortion has been around for long, long period of time, long before it became kind of the centerpiece of Christianity in the Western world. Um, what we're really talking about here when we think about abortion is not whether women are having them, But is there a way for them to have an abortion safe and legally? And of course, that's where it put us right in the court system and some of the things that grew out of Roe v. Wade and so forth. Now, what's interesting is various Christian denominations vary widely on this topic. Not so much in evangelicalism, it has become one of the dominant central focuses. However, if you scan across Christianity as a whole, there are certainly some that strictly oppose it, Catholicism, evangelicalism. There are some that allow for nuanced situations like rape or incest or danger to the mother's life. And then there's others that see it as a civil right that is reserved for women, and they have control over their own body and the decisions that they want to make. Now, the complexity of this issue is the silence of the scriptures. The number of times the Bible demands punishment for ending a pregnancy is zero. Abortion is not directly addressed in the Bible, so you have to piecemeal verses and try to put them together to come to some type of conclusion. Now, this is not to say that the Bible is pro-abortion. Don't get me to say that. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is it doesn't address the topic directly. And when you do try to make the Bible say something it doesn't address directly, you have to take bits and pieces and you have to take them usually out of context and try to make it fit a current cultural situation. So there's a reason that the Bible is silent about this. Number one, um, when it was done in ancient times, obviously it was a very dangerous thing that was done, and it was not too prominent because the more children that you had, the better off you were in terms of working the land in an agricultural environment. Their abortion was present, though. And what we find is that even in the first century, Jesus doesn't address the issue at all because in coming out of Judaism, Judaism did not forbid abortion. And so he never commented on it as if it was a problem. So when did abortion kind of take over in the debate? There's a claim among Christians that Christianity has always been opposed to abortion rights, and that's not really accurate. You might be surprised to know that evangelicals never collectively opposed abortion rights prior to Roe v. Wade in January of 1973 when it went through the court system. Ironically, some of the most conservative evangelicals, the Southern Baptist Convention, was officially pro-choice through much of the 1970s. By 1980, some things flipped, but the views were not as drastic in the 50s and 60s and even part of the 70s until Ronald Reagan was elected. Ronald Reagan made it a political issue more than a social issue or even a moral issue. He flipped to a very staunch anti-abortion Republican stance, and then he elevated it to be a litmus test for every good Republican politician and Supreme Court nominee. Now, why did he do that? Well, was he a dedicated Christian? Maybe. Was it because he was against it morally? Maybe. Was he using it for political advantage? Absolutely. The issue gave politicians kind of a moral veneer. And what I mean by that is it became kind of a way to harness Christianity and the votes of Christianity for the Republican Party. So it kind of turns out this way that if you're going to vote for a Democrat, you can't be a Christian. Voting for a Democrat is unthinkable because they're pro-abortion. Now, this kind of contributes, ironically, to a sense that, well, what Republicans promote is moral, but what Democrats promote is evil. Now, with the release of the Epstein files, we see that's all nonsense. Okay? We can see that plenty of Republicans are in the files. Many very powerful people have done some very nasty, ugly, immoral things, evil things. So it's not a Democrat issue. It's not a Republican issue. It has, since the 80s, become a political issue. And usually the verses that you have to turn to fight for an anti-abortion stance are kind of unusual. And I'm going to turn to a couple of them and try to explain them so that we understand that it's not really addressing the topic. So in Exodus chapter 21, I'm going to read just a short portion of it. In Exodus chapter 21, it talks about this whole chapter is talking about personal injuries that can happen from one person to another person. And when you get down to verse 22 of Exodus 21, it says this: if people are fighting, okay, so there's a ruckus already going on, and there's a crowd watching these people fight, and there's a pregnant woman in the crowd. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman, I don't take that as intentionally, but it could be, and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is a serious injury, which might suggest that the fetus is lost because this woman has been hit, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. So what that is basically the law of retaliation. And that is, you shouldn't go above and beyond the injury. You aren't to retaliate over and above. Now, notice the focus here is not on the fetus. The serious injury could be to the woman. There doesn't seem to be much that is said here about the fetus. You have to imply it. What we do see, though, is that the pregnant woman is the one that is being recognized in her personhood. And what we find is if it's no serious injury, there's a fine and it's taken care of. If there is a serious injury, there's more drastic consequences. If this woman dies, life for life. And of course, that also implies that the fetus would die with the mother, presumably. But this isn't really talking about a woman that doesn't want a pregnancy and wanting to abort that pregnancy. So you see, trying to use a passage like this to talk about abortion is really going through the back door. It seems as though whether it's the loss of the fetus or the serious injury of the woman, this is talking about a financial matter. That is, what type of monetary reimbursement can be made for the injury that was caused. So you have to be careful with this. Again, it's one of those passages that's not really talking about abortion per se. Then there's the claim that is made that life begins at conception. You won't find that in the scripture either. The Bible suggests that life begins with breath. Just like Adam, God breathed into him the breath of life. That also seems to be a part of the Jewish and philosophical tradition of the Jews, where often the term breath is used in Ezekiel, Job, and some other places. And it's the idea of when breath starts, life starts. Now, what's interesting is the rabbinic teachings. Rabbis viewed in Judaism the fetus as potential life, not life yet. And in fact, W.A. Criswell, who was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention for many years, he ministered down at First Baptist Dallas for 50 years. This is what he said. He says, I have always felt that it was only after a child was born and had a life separate from his mother or her mother that it became an individual person. Now, that wouldn't fly today. That comment wouldn't fly today, but that came from the president of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1973. Then another verse that is sometimes used is, well, didn't God say to Jeremiah, I knew you in your mother's womb? Jeremiah 1:5. Again, the idea here is primarily about how God had placed a call upon Jeremiah's life to be a prophet. And he would turn out to be a weeping prophet because nobody would listen to him for decades. So the question is the passage in Jeremiah talking about all fetuses, or is it specifically talking about Jeremiah having a calling upon his life? And just like Jonah had a calling upon his life, would he fulfill it or would he run away from it? If you read Jeremiah chapter 20, you'll see that Jeremiah curses God out because nobody's listening to him. And he says, you have pulled a fast one on me, God. You have called me to this ministry. And he then says, I wish I had never been born. Jeremiah says that in Jeremiah 20. Wish I'd never been born. Okay, let's move ahead. Now, here comes a strange passage. Okay, Numbers chapter 5. Now I am going to turn to this one. Now, the case can be made, and wrongfully so, I think, that this is encouraging abortion. I don't think that's that's happening at all. What's going on here, remember the book of Numbers is about a nomadic tribe of people that are trying to make their way through the wilderness toward the promised land. And what type of rules are you going to lay down for a brand new group of people? Well, that's what Numbers, along with Leviticus, is doing. It's laying down all kinds of policies, you might say, in order for this newly formed group of people that had been delivered out of Egypt to survive. So here you have the test for an unfaithful wife. Listen closely to this. This is amazing, really, when you think about it. All right, verse 11. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if a man's wife goes astray and is unfaithful to him, so that another man has sexual relations with her, and this is hidden from her husband, and her impurity is undetected, since there's no witness against her, and she has not been caught in the act, and if feelings of jealousy come over her husband, and he suspects, okay, take note of that word, he suspects his wife, and she is impure, or if he is jealous and he suspects her, even though she is not impure, then he is to take his wife to the priest. He must also take an offering of 1/10 of an ephah of barley flour on her behalf. He must not pour olive oil on it or put incense on it, because it is a grain offering for jealousy, a reminder offering to draw attention to the wrongdoing. The priest shall bring her and have her stand before the Lord. And then he shall take some holy water in a clay jar and put some dust from the tabernacle floor into the water. After the priest has had the woman stand before the Lord, he shall loosen her hair and place in her hands the reminder offering, the grain offering for jealousy, while he himself holds bitter water that brings a curse. Then the priest shall put the woman under oath and say to her, if no other man has had sexual relations with you, and you have not gone astray and become impure while married to your husband, may this bitter water that brings a curse not harm you. But if you have gone astray while married to your husband, and if you have made yourself impure by having sexual relations with a man other than your husband, here the priest is to put the woman under a curse. May the Lord cause you to become a curse among your people when he makes your womb miscarry and abdomen swell. May this water that brings a curse enter your body so that your abdomen swells or your womb miscarries, and then the woman is to say, Amen, so be it. All right, what is going on here? Okay, supposedly this is a test for an unfaithful wife. What we find is a ritual, and here this poor woman, again, it's by suspect of the husband, there's no witnesses to it. This husband makes her go before the priest. The priest makes up this concoction. She drinks it, and supposedly, if she's innocent, she's unharmed, and if she's guilty, she's going to miscarry. Now, is that abortion? Well, it could be an ancient idea of abortion, maybe. But the thing to see here is it's not talking again about a woman that has an unwanted pregnancy. It's talking about a situation that's built on suspicion and superstition. The superstition that if she drinks this water and miscarries, she's guilty. If she drinks it and the pregnancy continues, she's not guilty. Now, my question in this, though, is um, the husband suspects that his wife is cheating on him, but prior to the end of that passage, there's no mention of pregnancy at all until you get to the very end. Is that just assumed that because this woman, or is it because she's starting to show that he takes her to the priest? Okay, so it's kind of hard to fill in the blanks on that. But what we find here is that it really is not talking about abortion as we are debating about it. So that brings us to this: a dangerous consequence. One of the unpleasant truths that's often overlooked rather, by religious communities is that when they want abortion to end as part of a civil right, they're only ending safe, legal, and regulated abortions. Prior to abortion becoming a legality in 1973, women sought out doctors that would perform abortion without the supervision and regulation to keep it safe. So the idea that if you ask a Christian, well, do you think we'll ever get rid of abortion altogether? And if they're honest, they will say, probably not. So, in other words, what you're really trying to take away is safe, legal, and regulated abortion so that you can feel good about it. Or is this simply on the radar because it's such a political football that you can divide us and them? We are pro-life, and you should vote for us. They are pro-abortion. You shouldn't vote for them. You see, the problem is the unwanted pregnancy. Abortion is the symptom. The problem is the unwanted pregnancy. So why do women seek abortions in the first place? Here's a statistic that might shock you. The truth is, 95% of women seeking abortion already have children. It's not like they want to get rid of the kids so that they can continue to live some type of wild lifestyle. It's usually because of poverty. And they don't want to have another mouth to feed, or they can't clothe that child. What I've often had a complaint about is not that you would want women to give birth. I'm good with that. It'd be great if all women could carry their pregnancies to term. However, isn't it amazing that the pro-life movement abandons any type of policies that would help women who decide to keep their baby? So let's move to this idea here is the social programming that is often voted down by Congress and the Senate that would help women keep their children. And you can throw out a tagline and say, well, these women should just put the baby up for adoption. Well, that's not as simple either. It's a complicated, very, very complicated topic. What I'm trying to show you here is it has been used by Christians and some portions of the church as a way of casting shame, guilt, all these type of things upon women. But most importantly, it has been used as a political football, the other one being LGBTQ rights. Those are still the two big issues that are used to push a voting bloc to vote for conservative politics. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, uh, as we begin to think a little bit about the idea of immigration and scapegoating people that are not our ethnicity, you're beginning to move closer to the Christian nationalist position we're seeing today. The idea that foreigners cannot be trusted, they shouldn't be allowed within our country. Um, and when you have a president that is saying that they're all rapists and murderers and stuff like that, then all of a sudden, the claim that these people that, and I'm going to talk about asylum in a moment, are illegal, are just lawbreakers. That's all they're doing. And then they try to justify their position by saying, well, you shouldn't question it. So in Romans chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, the Apostle Paul, who's living in the Roman Empire, and it's a quite violent empire at times, says this, which is interesting. Let everyone be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. So that's where it stops. The quotation is stopped there. Um, okay, you have to listen to us. Shut up. This is what our decisions are. You can't push back on it. Unfortunately, it's applied to some very unfortunate situations upon families who are fleeing from their country because their life and their family's life is in danger. And of course, most of the people are coming up from Central America and Mexico that are trying to get out of the throes of bloodshed and violence. They come to our doorstep, our southern border. And now it becomes a huge problem because how do you regulate this? How do you um, how do you honor a rule that is in place? And that is, they are legally allowed to apply for asylum in our country. But before I get to that, so this group of people that quote Romans 13 verses 1 and 2, they they don't keep reading, because if you keep reading, it's the authority that also is supposed to do good. In verse 4 it says, "For the one in authority is God's servant for your good." Oh, not just negative, not just pushing back, but they are put in place, and it goes on and says, to punish wrongdoers, but also to bless those who are keeping the law. And then he says in verse 6, this is why you pay your taxes. Oh, okay. These people are put in place by people who are paying their taxes to protect them and to do good for them. And it's not just this authority power to be able to make decisions and to separate children from their parents and all that goes with this topic. Well, sometimes those that are uh, pushing for no new immigration or no foreigners allowed to come into our country will turn to the story of the Tower of Babel. And if you read the Tower of Babel, you know that this tower that is being built um, is done so under the cooperation of those who are all speaking the same language. So God disperses them and they scatter, and various languages are introduced into the human experience. Now, that's a story way of talking about the diversity of languages and cultures that we have in our world. It's probably not the most scientific way of explaining how it developed, but nonetheless, this is sometimes used, and the mentality might be something like this: well, let them stay with their own people, let them stay in their own culture, let them stay with their own language. And so it kind of becomes a way of justifying priority and prioritizing resources only for native born citizens, even though Jesus will prioritize giving to other people. Go the extra mile, give the extra coat, those type of ideas. Now, let me come to this. So when people come to our borders, they have the legal right to apply for asylum. Now, this is not asylum in the sense of a mental institution that's holding people that are dangerous to society. Asylum is a legal right to apply for protection from persecution and harm in their own country. 1951, the Refugee Convention states that that is a legal right. They should come and they should go uh, to the governing authorities at the border and say, I am applying for asylum. And then the procedures and the different standards and border policies are to then take these people in and to protect them until it goes through the court. Now, the problem is many times these procedures and eligibility standards and border policies change with different administrations and court rulings and stuff. So it's always a moving target. Native born citizens often resist this because usually in the border towns, there are small towns that can't absorb the mere mass of people that are coming in and putting a stress and strain upon the system that is needed by way of resources. So the real problem becomes the long backlogs that happen because there's not enough court proceedings in order to keep up with those that are applying for asylum. It's complicated, very complicated, but it's not a simple, oh, all of these people trying to come across the border are bad people. That's misleading the public. And so, again, this is one of those issues of church and hate, where it's easy to hate immigrants and foreigners because of what we've been told, and we don't push back and do our own thinking on the matter. And then the third group. So we talked a little bit about those women who want an abortion, those foreigners who are seeking asylum, and the poor who are seeking food and shelter. So America leads the world in Christians who believe that Jesus wants us to help the poor rather, by cutting programs that actually help the poor. All of this is a funding issue in many respects. So how are you going to morally justify this selfishness that says we don't want to help other people, we don't want to give, we want to keep it all to ourselves? But Jesus commands individuals and he commands nations to care for the poor. And this video clip that I'll show you at the very end here in a few moments, we'll talk a little bit about that. So I won't over comment on that. But this all has really come to play since the 1980s and Reaganomics that took over, and Christian America that has been conned into believing that, hey, if you give all these breaks to people that have money, there will be a trickle down effect that will then provide for the poor. I don't think I can honestly say that that has ever happened or it has ever worked. Usually it never trickles down. So wherever we are on the economic scale, and if we claim to be a Christ follower, we can't hate on the poor. That's who Jesus ministered to the most in his earthly ministry. And yet, how often in church circles do we demonize the poor? So there is a motive behind this, and I call it smearing the poor for inspiration and profit. Many people, including Christians, often stigmatize the poor with ugly, ugly stereotypes. And usually they vilify that person's poverty because of their own personal failings, either poor decisions, misuse of alcohol or drugs, lack of an education, dropping out of school, all these type of things. Once you work a little bit with people who have a hard go of it, you will see that many of them have just had an unfortunate roll of the dice in their life, and they don't know how to get out of it. To believe that economically struggling people deserve what they're going through is heartless. It really is. So when groups come along and say we should be helping the poor, we should be trying to eliminate not only poverty but starvation and around the world, you have politicians that will stigmatize the poor. So let's go back to Ronald Reagan again. He called these people welfare queens. Okay? They need help, but we don't want to give it to them. They're welfare queens. Are there people that take advantage of the system? Absolutely. Just like there's people that take advantages of loopholes in our tax system. There's people that take advantage at your work knowing that they can get away with not doing very much. And so they take advantage of not putting in a good day's work. I mean, the list could go on. Remember when Speaker of the House Paul Ryan talked about a culture of poverty because the poor are lazy. Is that true? Well, it can be. But is it a blanket statement that's true of everyone? No. Thirdly, the Trump administration proposed cuts to SNAP, Medicaid, and social programs in every budget that it's proposed. And so this narrative that the poor are morally deficient, we shouldn't help them, flies in the face of Jesus, who allowed the poor to touch him, and he touched them. And so often when you can stigmatize the poor, then you can get away from talking about the big issues, and that is generational poverty, educational inequity, union busting by business owners that provide protections, globalization, taking jobs away, sending them overseas, all these type of things that can leave people with nowhere to turn. And trust me, if they work for minimum wage, they're not putting anything on the table. Okay? Minimum wage won't even pay for rent. Okay. So, having said that, eventually you got to get around to Jesus on this topic. You know, Jesus talks more about the dangers of money and greed than anything else in the Gospels. Page through it, you'll find that that is his dominant topic. The kingdom of God should be a movement of people that emphasize community, mutual care, sharing of resources. Think Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 4, as a way of helping. Once again, quoting Paul out of context is sometimes a pushback. So 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10 says, and Ronald Reagan quoted this verse, if a man will not work, then he should not eat. This is pulled out of context again. What's the problem in 2 Thessalonians? 2 Thessalonians is about a group of people who think that Jesus is coming within their lifetime. As a result of that, they said, well, why should I work my fingers to the bone? Jesus could be coming at any time. I will simply wait in anticipation for the return of Jesus. And Paul is saying, no, if you're not going to work, you're not going to eat. That's an isolated application to a group of people who had a misunderstanding about the return of Christ. So the idea here, I think, is using this topic many times within church to justify a meaner type of Christianity. And so, you know, there are some Christians that want a meaner Jesus, not a Jesus with compassion and so forth. So the scripture becomes a weapon in many respects. And you could read this passage if you want in Matthew chapter 26. Jesus says, the poor you will always have with you. Again, that's often used as a justification not to help the poor. You can't help them anyways. Well, if you look in the life of Jesus, a lot of this was pushback on how Jesus allowed people to get close to him. And in the case of one woman, she pours some expensive perfume on Jesus to anoint him before his death. And Jesus, after the disciples criticize her actions, he says, hey, she's doing this out of love, and don't hold her back. And what Jesus is saying here is, my death is imminent. It's coming. This is an act of love and devotion. He's not talking about squandering resources. He's just saying, listen, I'm not going to be around with you much longer. Here's a moment of opportunity. So Jesus is in full agreement with many of the Old Testament passages like Deuteronomy and Leviticus that talks about caring for the poor, watching over their situation, whether it's not gleaning the full field to the edges, but leaving the edges for the poor to glean, or whether it is something as drastic as the year of Jubilee, where all debts are released. That never happened, incidentally. That was an in theory only type of thing to release the debts. There's no evidence that that actually ever took place. So, what do we do with this? Did God go woke? Because that's the verbiage that's often used in our day and age. You know, oh, that's woke. All you got to do is look, and you can read these verses on your own. Jesus is all about leaning into the prophets, leaning into the Torah, and speaking out against injustice. And he constantly is implying that there should be certain social and economic reforms. So you can read those. What Jesus does do is reflect the heart of God. And his ministry is often expressed with those that we want to push to the side. The Beatitudes talk about that. He talks about bringing good news to these people in Luke 4. He talks about their prominent place in the kingdom of God in Luke chapter 6. You can turn to other passages as well, driving out the money changers. You know that story where he goes in and he overturns the profit tables of those that are selling animals and for sacrifice and on the Passover. And what you find is that all four gospel writers, all four of them, write about this incident. That's unusual. Not all four gospel writers repeat everything almost verbatim as this story. So the gospel writers are opposed to taking advantage. And what we find is that the cleansing of the temple that happens is on Holy Monday. Passover is coming. You have the triumphal entry on Sunday. And on Holy Monday, he drives out these money changers in full view of the religious authorities and the occupying Romans that are there to keep things under control. So that's what this section of the book is all about. Talking about those three groups of people: women who are pregnant, seeking an abortion, foreigners that we call immigrants, and those who are poor. So the Gospels are showing Jesus as a revolutionary in his time to help people rethink some of these political and social issues. And he often calls out people for their materialism, for not rethinking about how a society is to be structured and how it is to be governed. So you can read, if you are into studying this, some of these cross references that I put on the slide. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop the recording, and then I'm going to show you a 10-minute video, and then we'll come back together and see if you have any questions. So what I want to do first is stop the recording at this time. If I can find it. Here we go.